anyway.
Very, very interesting, Anne, and I hope you're okay now and you've gone on to form, more satisfying and mutually supportive relationships. Good to talk to you. Let's go to Dr. Adam Perkins, lecturer in the neurobiology of personality. God, what a fascinating specialism at King's College. Hello, Dr. Perkins. Morning.
Hi, Vanessa.
I think I'd better ask you a question I haven't yet asked to kick off, and then we'll carry on. The thing I need to know is it possible to be treated for narcissism? Can narcissists be taught not to be narcissistic?
It's an unclear area at the moment, but my gut feeling is that they can't.
Uh-huh.
I would suggest that it's a sort of cognitive style where you see yourself as above other people and are not going to change. It's not similar to depression, for example. Someone can become depressed. They enter a state when they don't enjoy what they used to enjoy, such as socializing or food, but with appropriate therapy, either cognitive behavioral therapy or pharmacological therapy, they can change back to what they were. A cognitive style, we see this also in psychopathy, it's just a way of viewing the world that appears to be in there from very early on.
All right, next question. Are narcissists born or are they made? In other words, I think we can all remember, we've all seen around us, mothers, usually sometimes fathers too, who idolise their little princes and princesses, their sultans and sultanas, treat them as the centre of the universe. Are we therefore setting them up to become narcissists, or is it some kind of genetic predisposition and it's nothing to do with us?
The simple answer is a combination of genes and environment. There's an interplay. So let's say a person has a particularly high dose of genes for narcissism. We don't know what these genes are, but they must be there somewhere.
Yes.
We know that from twin studies. Then, pretty much regardless of their parenting, they will turn out highly selfish and narcissistic. If a person has a very low dose of genes for narcissism, even if they're idolized, they'll still turn out humble. But those are extreme cases. Most of us are somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
So we are responsive to our environment in that case. So we're the sort of easily swayed kids if we're in the middle, and we will, if we're idolized and treated like a little emperor, we'll start acting like one and start believing it.
Right. And so we all have narcissistic traits in us, and we need to have them to a certain extent, don't we? We need to have self-belief, we need confidence, we need a competitive streak. There are all sorts of things. We need to think we're attractive, otherwise no one will ever fancy us. We need a certain level of not self-love, but at least self-appreciation and to some extent a little bit of self-absorption. Otherwise, we don't amount to much. But we need a limit on it, don't we? We need, and the limiter in general, I suppose, is empathy. In other words, my desire for the last cake should be preempted by my desire to give my child the last cake, or a man who looks hungry, give him a cake, or share the cake with my sister because she equally well wants the cake. I shouldn't just jump in, pounce on it and gobble it up, should I?
But from what I understand of narcissism, people who are very narcissistic don't have that empathy. That's why they're like that.
Right.
It doesn't hold them back. But I think that you make a good point that we all have a level. The way to think about personality is not as a discrete type,
right,
but just as a continuum. So when
you say discrete, that means separate, doesn't it?
Separate.
Yes.
Right. We all have a score on height, for example. There's no one who doesn't have a height. We all have a height. So therefore, we all have a level of narcissism. Some of us are very high, some of us are very low, but most of us are somewhere in the middle. And a good way of thinking about this is to just sort of imagine yourself back in the kind of ancestral human environment, which would have been a small group of hunter-gatherers.
Yes.
Let's say 20 people. If you're really, really, really humble, way down the narcissism scale, you're probably not going to do that well because you'll be elbowed out of the way in the rush for a slice of mammoth meat.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you're extremely selfish and narcissistic and you consistently shove other people out of the way to get to the mammoth and carve off a piece, then you probably come to a sticky end because you're living in such a small group, they won't put up with it for long. So what this has meant is that people who are at the very, very extreme ends of low or high narcissism would have sort of been pruned out of the population.
But they haven't been, though, have we? We find ourselves surrounded by them at the moment.
But what I mean is that pruning process just produces an average, an adaptive average, like height.
Right.
Very, very tall people and very, very small people back in the caveman times would have been pruned out again, just for the survival reasons. So it doesn't stop tall people being born just by random shuffling of genes.
No.
But but they wouldn't have done that well, and so there's a sort of selection pressure on around the medium, and in the case of narcissism, it's adaptive to be not a doormat, so not to be so humble that people just elbow you out of the way in the struggle for existence, but not to be hopelessly over narcissistic and extremely viewing yourself as extremely special.
No. Do narcissists normally get rumbled? I mean, in the end, do people say, actually, you're so lacking in empathy, you're so selfish, you think you're superior to everybody else, you're commandeering all the emotions and all the money and all the stuff, I don't like you, I don't want to work for you, I don't want to marry you, I don't want to hang out with you. Do narcissists normally get rumbled?
That's a very interesting point, because I would say that it depends on the size of the population. So if we look in general at personality disorders such as narcissism or psychopathy,
yes.
If you could once again go back to the traditional small-scale human group, they wouldn't have lasted long. There's been some anthropological work with Eskimos,
right,
and looking at psychopathy in Eskimos, and it turns out there are psychopaths, or there historically were the occasional psychopath in Eskimo communities, but they didn't last long.
Yes,
they would just be shoved off an ice floe when nobody was looking. But don't
know why I laughed at that. Maybe that shows a certain psychopathy. I didn't mean to laugh. I'm sorry. I apologise.
If you fast forward to the modern world, where we have millions of people living in cities where they don't know each other very well,
yes,
this is a much more advantageous situation for a person with an extreme personality type. So it's at the high end of the psychopathy scale or the narcissism scale,
right?
Because they can meet somebody, abuse them, and then move on before they've sort of been rumbled.
And no one really realises.
And nobody really realises.
Okay, now we keep using the words narcissistic and psychopathic as if they're interchangeable. Are they interchangeable?
No,
or are psychopaths the horrible kind of Hannibal Lecter murdering types, and narcissists are just the vain, sort of boasting, self-centred types, one more innocuous than the other? There's
a lot of debate about how to carve up the personality domain, particularly at the level of psychiatric disorders. No one knows for sure, but it would seem to be the case that psychopaths are fundamentally based on, they have a cognitive style that places little value on the fair treatment of others.
Right. So
they sort of squeal when they're treated unfairly, but are totally fine with conning other people.
Right.
It's a sort of one-way street in a moral view. That may or may not overlap with feeling special. But at the moment, they're classed as separate disorders. So an overwhelming feeling of specialness is not regarded as the same thing as being a psychopath.
Thanks for talking to us, Dr. Adam Perkins. Let's go to Sean in Whitechapel. Hi, Sean.